I recorded this section when I made my original recordings, and upon listening to it, I was not happy with the flow, so I'm redoing it and including a little more information, so don't get confused if you saw the previous version of this. Before getting into the design of your cover, I need to go over the issue of choosing which images you want to use for your cachet. The reason I'm getting into this is because we're potentially dealing with issues of permissions and copyrights. These days, it's easy to go online and grab images off the internet and use them however you want, and normally that's not a big deal. However, though you may have heard about the concept of fair use in using copyrighted material for personal purposes, this is not necessarily that simple, as fair use is a legal defense, not a delineated doctrine. Courts determine fair use by analyzing four factors: purpose, nature of work, amount used, and market effect. Though it's also usually accepted that you can use some copyrighted materials in derivative works, this is also not as simple as it sounds. When you're creating a philatelic cover, it could be argued that you're creating a derivative work with yourself as the artist. But as far as I know, there's no actual case law determining either of these two scenarios. Though it's unlikely a copyright holder will come after you for printing out a copy of their image for your own private use and slapping it onto an envelope, it's always best to play it safe. So you should first and foremost try to avoid using copyrighted images for your covers unless you have specific permission to do so. As someone who holds copyrights to several printed works myself, I take this very seriously, and you should as well. Philately has long been considered a respectful and dignified hobby, and as a philatelist, you have a moral obligation to try to protect other people's intellectual property. I do have to emphasize, though, I am a historian, not an attorney, so take anything I say with a grain of salt, and if unsure, consult an attorney, or maybe just consider using a different image altogether. Fortunately, this is where a little creativity on your part will help. If you can come up with your own image, either via computer-generated drawing tools or hand drawing, then you'd be free to use them, as it's your own work. Now, if you can't come up with your own images, though, there are ways you can go about getting images that aren't going to be too troublesome. Many years ago, I purchased a collection of thousands of different images on CDs, some of which you may have seen on the covers I showed in the introduction. These clip art images were divided into several categories, and I have full rights to use them however I wish. I've been able to mine that collection for several cachet images over the years, and I likely will never be able to get through all of them. Although the days of going into Best Buy and purchasing big CD collections of images is largely over, there are similar collections online which you can use. Recently, I purchased a collection of images from Etsy.com, which I was able to use for making covers when a major solar eclipse was passing by. There were several cancellations scheduled in cities where the eclipse was going to pass over, and I paid only a few dollars and ended up with dozens of images I was able to use for my cachets. I've also recently purchased a set of images for use in celebrating the upcoming semi-quincentennial of the U.S. The celebrations will be taking place throughout 2026, and as you can see, I have several dozen images which I can use. These all cost me only a few dollars per collection, and aside from Etsy, there are many other sites where you can get collections of images for fairly low prices. There are also places online where you can purchase images individually, though doing so piecemeal might get a bit expensive, so you might want to be careful with that. In general, images created by the U.S. government and its agencies are not covered by copyright, because federal law removes copyright protection from works of the U.S. government. This restriction extends to any work prepared by an officer or employee of the United States government as part of that person's official duties. Fortunately for me, many of my covers are space related, and NASA's official policy clarifies that NASA still images, among other types of files, are generally not copyrighted, and NASA material may be reproduced and distributed without further permission from NASA. Although that's normally the case whenever I use an image from NASA, from a NASA website or a government website, I always include a line at the bottom saying something to the effect of image courtesy of NASA or whichever agency or website I got it from. I can show you an example here. It's an Apollo-Soyuz painting, but painting by Burt Winthrop, image courtesy nasa.gov. Now, aside from government websites, Wikipedia has a fairly good article regarding copyrighted images, which I'd encourage you to read through. And they have a related sister site called Wikimedia Commons, which has the stated goal of developing and maintaining open content, multilingual, wiki-based projects and providing the full contents of those projects to the public free of charge. They have a large collection of images that include the copyright information in an easy-to-cite format. Generally speaking, the use of those images for non-commercial purposes should be okay as long as you attribute the source. Now, regarding the use of postal images, the use of postal images is a good option, though it's a bit more complicated, and you'll see that in this cache that I've made, it does include some postal images, and I'll explain why this is okay. The U.S. postal system as it exists today is a replacement of a previous cabinet-level department known as the U.S. Post Office Department, the USPOD. The USPOD ceased to exist in 1971 with the creation of the USPS. Postage stamps printed under the USPOD are generally in the public domain at this point. This brings us to the issue of counterfeiting. Generally speaking, USPS is very friendly toward philately and the use of postal images for philately, as long as such is not done in order to defraud the service. In other words, you shouldn't scan valid U.S. postage stamps and then print out copies that can be used as postage, as that is an actual crime, and I shouldn't actually have to even say that. So, what qualifies as valid U.S. postage? Well, in 1861, at the beginning of the American Civil War, post offices in the southern states were in possession of large stocks of U.S. postage stamps. The Confederate Postmaster General reportedly ordered that all such stamps be sent back up north at the beginning of the war when they were attempting to make a clean break from the U.S. But it's not known and seems unlikely to me that any southern post office actually bothered to do this, which means that potentially a lot of these stamps could be sold for use in the north, with the profits then being potentially used to fund the rebellion. For this reason, the U.S. Congress in 1861 demonetized all postage stamps that might be in possession of southern states, and thus any stamps issued before 1861 are no longer valid as postage. These stamps that you see here are no longer valid as postage, and they're in the public domain, so I can use them. Any other stamps, including really old stamps over 100 years old, are still valid as postage, anything after 1861. And they're valid as postage for the amount that was paid, because a stamp is essentially the receipt or a proof of payment for a fee being paid for a government service. This means that if you have a 5-cent stamp that's over 100 years old, so long as it wasn't produced before 1861, it's still worth theoretically 5 cents. Obviously, mailing a letter now costs a lot more, but the value of the stamps remains the same. Any stamp made after the date of 1861 is still technically valid as postage. Okay? Now, fortunately, many postal products these days also include very nice images in the margins and salvage. I'll give you an example here. You see here, there's nice images here. And these are printed on the same self-adhesive paper as the stamp themselves. So if you were to cut up such images and place them on your cover, that should be okay. As would be the use of these images, images used in promotional materials used to advertise postal products. So generally speaking, reproducing such images should be okay. Once again, this is as long as it's not being done for commercial purposes. For practical purposes, what this means is that if you're reproducing part of a stamp image, you should be okay as long as you resize it so it no longer matches or approximates the size of the original and cannot be confused for an attempt at counterfeiting. So for instance, this Muhammad Ali stamp, you could actually take this image from the label sheet, stick it onto your envelope, you'd be fine. You could maybe even scan a version of this, enlarge it, and put it on there. Should be okay because you're not trying to use it as postage. Okay? Like I said, you cannot allow it to be confused for an attempt at counterfeiting. Now, what throws a little wrinkle in this is that recently the Postal Service has been licensing images such as those for Bugs Bunny and Star Wars characters, more recently SpongeBob SquarePants, and these have been used on postage stamps, so there might be issues there if you try to use those images, if you try to scan and replicate those images. However, fortunately for such topics, there's no shortage of pre-made stickers, labels that you can purchase commercially and just stick them on your cover before or after getting it canceled. Now, if there's an image that you absolutely need to use and you're unsure about permissions for it, you can always try to simply get permission to use it from the copyright holder. I have, in very few instances, used trademarked images with permission. In such cases, I actually went as far as contacting the copyright holder via email explaining that I'd like to use their image in a limited way and not for commercial purposes, and asking for their permission. One gentleman who had designed a Mercury project patch told me that he'd let me use the image in a small amount of covers as long as I sent him one, which I was more than happy to do as it allowed me to show off some of my work. So, in order to keep this simple, the images I'm using in this project are all in the public domain, and these instructions will operate on the assumption that any covers you make are for your own personal use and not to be intended for commercial gain. You will see throughout this series that I normally make 3 copies of each cover, so I can choose which cancellation came out best, and I keep the rest for trading purposes. I do realize that all of these may end up getting sold off at some point after my death. I have no control over that, but I'm not trying to make a profit here. And I'm assuming that if you're watching this, that's not your intention either. So I'm going to pause now so that we can start talking more about the actual design process on the envelope that I've selected.